Everyone, welcome to today's forums on Milk Tea Alliance, Precedents and Possibilities. I'm Ming Xiu Ho. I'm the Director of Research Institute for the Humanity and Social Sciences based in Taiwan. The topic today, the Milk Tea Alliance, is an online pro-democracy campaign. It started as a meme on the internet, an internet hashtag, but it gets really started across different regions and countries, including Hong Kong, Thailand, and Myanmar and Taiwan. And today we are very happy to have our distinguished guest speakers, Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom, with us. He is an established Chinese historian. He is currently a chancellor professor at University of California at Irvine, and he began his academic career in studying Chinese student movement well before the 1989 Tiananmen incident. And more recently, he has been paying attention to the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong, and he has numerous publications on that. So we are very happy to have him join us from California. And also joining us today are two discussants. Let me introduce them. Professor Kim Man Chen. He is a sociologist with a PhD from Yale. He has been teaching for a long time in Chinese University in Hong Kong. And he was also he has been a long time a campaigner for democracy in Hong Kong. He has been one of the three initiators of the Occupy Central with Love campaigns that get started in 2013 and that evolved into Umbrella Movement in 2014. And he has been given a sentence for 16 months in jail for his involvement. And more recently, he has become a visiting professor in National Zhengzhou University. And our second discussant is Professor Lev Nachman. He is a political scientist with a PhD from University of California at Irvine. He studied the party formation in the wake of Taiwan Sunflower Movement. And he's also a very young, active scholar in many arenas. And he just gets started to work with the National Zhengzhou University College of Social Sciences. So I'm very excited about our forum because it talks about a transnational issue that is still emerging today, ongoing right now. And we are also connecting different time zones. We have dialogue across different academic disciplines, and we have participants and observers joining us together. And we are going to have Professor Wasserstrom to talk or to share his observation on Milk Tea Alliance for around 45 minutes. And afterward, we'll have Kim and Lev for discussion, each with 10 minutes. And then we'll open up the question and answer time, and we'll invite the audience to type their questions in on the online forum. So the whole event will be around 90 minutes. So without further ado, let's invite Professor Wasserstrom. So Jeff, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event. I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person to see you all and go out to lunch with the panelists afterwards. It's very fitting to be talking about this here and to be introduced by Ming Xiu because I'm using his book right now to explore the transnational side of what might be called one of the Milk Tea Alliance connections before the term Milk Tea Alliance came. Milk Tea Alliance was not coined as a term until 2020 to refer to places where there were struggles against authoritarianism in the shadow of Beijing, in places where you often drink your tea with milk, whereas on the mainland, often you drink your tea without milk. As an aside, I will tell you, I have been interviewing participants in the Milk Tea Alliance or people who feel affiliated with it for about a year now. And one way that I've done this is to meet up with them at coffee and tea. And none of them has ever ordered milk tea when I've asked them what drinks you get. They always want cappuccino or latte or something kind of coffee. These are young people who don't necessarily want to actually drink the milk tea, but they like the symbol of it. It's also fitting to have the commentators that I have. Kinman, the first time that I heard him speak was on a panel, again, before the Milk Tea Alliance, at the Association for Asian Studies meetings. It was a session on democracy movements in different parts of Asia. And I believe he was paired with somebody who was talking about struggles in Thailand and somebody talking about struggles in Burma, places that are now connected to this idea of a Milk Tea Alliance. But at that point, they were seen as movements that had parallels from a kind of social scientific perspective, but were not yet really being seen as linked. There were starting to be some links between Hong Kong and Thai activists. So it's very fitting to have him be a comment, and he's somebody I'm interviewing for this project as well. And Lev, finally, is somebody I was on his dissertation committee at Irvine. And so we've had discussions about parallels and contrasts, connections between Taiwan and Hong Kong activism for the last several years. So it's a great pleasure to do this. So my perspective, the Milk Tea Alliance is a slippery kind of subject to pin down. It's not something that has formal organizations. It's more a set of shared interests and possible connections. So part of my project is to figure out how to make sense of it. And the way that I'm approaching it, which I think has to do with the interdisciplinarity of this session, I'm playing the historian's card, and I'm trying to think about how is this like other configurations or other connections that crossed national borders and other kinds of borders in the past, and what kinds of parallels are there? There are some things about the Milk Tea Alliance that are distinctively 21st century. The fact that much of it takes place online, in cyberspace, internet connections, that it's routines for people who have not met each other but have interacted via social media. And that may seem, that may seem to set it apart, but often I feel there are echoes of earlier periods when I've thought about things that, or read about things that do have parallels of connections between places. And actually, the thing I've become increasingly interested in now is this very fact that at a moment such as the present, where a lot of the connections between activists are done online, it would seem that physical proximity would become fairly irrelevant as a variable, that there'd be no particular reason for there to be stronger connections between people who were one country over or one region over. And yet there is still something that carries over, even in a period of globalization. Regional ties can be very important. The other thing that I've been noticing and being interested in is that when the stories of individual protest movements are narrated, they often are narrated within tightly constrained geographical borders. And the fact that people are very aware of what's going on in other parts of the world or nearby sometimes get left out of the story that's told of this. Now, when you're a real specialist on the umbrella movement, for example, you will know that there was discussion within the umbrella movement of what had just happened in Taiwan during the sunflower movement. And it was a kind of common sense at the time that these were connected, they were in the air. But I'm already noticing that in some histories of, I was just reading something that was a kind of general history of protests of the 2010s. And when it got to the Hong Kong chapter in that, Taiwan wasn't mentioned because the story was of one place. And I think this is something that recurs in the past too. There are times 100 years ago, 120 years ago, when it was very important that activists were aware of what was going on in other places. But sometimes that's something that is kind of rediscovered by people who pay attention to it. It doesn't always show up in the written record of it. As I was doing my interviews, to give you just one example of this, I'd read a little bit about the Burmese uprising of 1988. That was a daring movement that was crushed. It was crushed 1 year before the daring movement in China was crushed with Tiananmen. And I first became aware of the 1988 protests and paid attention to them when a student came to work on a senior thesis at Indiana when I was teaching there. He was an exile from the Burmese movement in 1988. And he was fascinated by the fact that when he told people about Burma in 88, it was so much less well known in America than Tiananmen was. And so he wrote a thesis comparing Tiananmen and the Burmese uprising of 88. And I thought of these two movements as parallel. When I read up on the 1988 movement, though, it was often told as a story that was simply about what was going on in Burma. And when I interviewed the same youth who had been now is not a youth, I've stayed in touch and stayed friends with him since that time when he was an undergraduate in the early 1990s. And when I was interviewing him for this project and asking him about, so Tiananmen came a year later, were there events going on at the same time that were particularly influential to you, that you were thinking about, that gave you a sense of a possibility? And he said that when he came from the village into Yangon, what everybody was talking about was people power in the Philippines, and how a dictator, much like the dictator they were living under, who was actually seen as connected to the dictator they were living under, had been toppled. And that he talked about it as it was kind of common sense. Listening to the Burmese radio service on BBC, he heard about what people had done against seemingly impossible odds, against a dictatorship that seemed as though it would sort of always be there. And yet it had been toppled by people taking to the streets. And that was very important to him. And when he was telling me about this, it wasn't just that it was important to him, but he made it sound as though that was something that people, he talked about as tea shop talk, that when people got together in the tea shops, of course they were talking about the Philippines, but that wouldn't necessarily be something that would end up in the written record. It was simply commonsensical. So this project began with the main question that I wanted to ask was, why do people stay with a movement after it hits what seems to be a kind of impossible obstacle, when it hits what would seem like a dead end or a defeat? And yet people stay with, some of the people stay with that movement, even in seemingly impossible times. And it seems to me that it's more common in the social sciences and when people study social movements, that there's a lot of attention paid to what gets people to join a movement, what leads to mobilization, what gets people out onto the streets. And then about an organization that's founded that continues, that can be something that gets attention, as Lev has worked on. But this sort of more nebulous question of when it seems that something has been crushed and people end up in prison, in exile, or just going quiet, what is it that psychologically leads people to stick with something that seems impossible? So now those are some of the questions I'm wrestling with, and I'll just read one part that I hope will kind of give you a sense of the idea of Milk Tea Alliance-like events before the Milk Tea Alliance, and how the historian in me is part of this project, as well as a kind of more journalistic and more social scientific side in the interviews I'm doing. So here's just a small part read aloud. As the second decade of the century ended and the third decade of the century began, activists from various Asian countries located on or near the Pacific Rim were struggling to bring change to the political communities they loved. Their grievances were varied. Some were angry at domestic autocrats. Some also, or instead, chafed at repression associated with a distant capital. Some took action within their homelands. Others took steps abroad as political exiles. The ideologies and tactics that appealed to different groups of activists in this group were not always the same. Still, when they learned of and came across each other, they often felt a strong sense of recognition. And when they heard news of a struggle taking place in a part of East or Southeast Asia other than their own, it often seemed striking to them how similar the symbols that participants were drawn to and the threats participants faced were to those they themselves were deploying and encountering. Sometimes they tried to find ways to work together across cultural, geographical, and linguistic divides, and they expressed support for what their comrades in other places were doing. Now, the paragraph that I've just read could be about the Milk Tea Alliance. It could be about the present. The exiles in question in this case would include people from Thailand and Burma. They would include Hong Kongers such as Nathan Law, or indeed Kinman. For Nathan Law and his counterparts from Tibet and Xinjiang, say, the distant capital seen as a source of repressive policies is, of course, a Beijing that has long been the seat of power for a communist party. And sometimes it's a capital that casts a shadow, even if it's not directly controlling. And activists in Thailand feel that the shadow that Beijing is casting on Thailand is important too. But everything that I read in that opening, that part that I read aloud, every single word in it could also be about not the early 2020s, but the early 1920s, the period when the Chinese Communist Party that now holds power in Beijing was founded. And when the people moving from place to place could include people who were temporary exiles and came back to be part of that movement. Now, there are plenty of contrasts between the early 1920s and the early 2020s. Not just were different capitals associated with repression. In the 1920s, the capitals that some people were moving against were London and Paris, that were the seats of empires, or the rising, the one that was casting a shadow was Tokyo as well. There were different media involved, there were different methods, there were different ideologies and different organizations that are central to today's stories as opposed to tales of resistance a century ago. Current counterparts to globe-trotting anti-imperialist activists like Ho Chi Minh and Zhou Enlai in that earlier period, the current ones are more likely to cross paths in Taipei than in Paris, and they're more likely to exchange ideas online than via letters. But the loose connections associated with is now sometimes called the Milk Tea Alliance, well, they're different from those established a century ago via groups that were linked to Moscow and to anti-colonialist leagues. And yet there are parallels. I've been thinking a lot about them for the last 2.5 years now, ever since I read Tim Harper's wonderful account of the earlier period in a book called Underground Asia, that's beautifully written and tries to recover what it was like for these activists and exiles of the period in the early 20th century, including many that were much less famous than Ho Chi Minh and Zhou Enlai, many whose struggles ended up in dead ends, many of whom died before seeing revolutions succeed. When I was steeped in work on Hong Kong protests for the last book I wrote, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, I read Tim Harper's book at the time when I was trying to think about what many kinds of things could happen next when the protesters who were involved in the Hong Kong protests were ending up in jail or in exile. And when I read Harper's book, and he talked about people who spent much of their time in jail or in exile, and sometimes and often were connected with each other, a term in that 1920s, early 20th century period, people often describe themselves as belonging to lost countries and trying to figure out a way to imagine a future that would get them, either their country would stop being lost or they would create other kinds of connections across borders. And I heard so many echoes of that period in talking about when Harper was talking about people meeting up and forming a sense of kinship with each other, trading tracts in a port like Shanghai. I thought about parallels to people of the current generation who find each other online and trade messages on social media. But I've also been thinking about connections between the early 2020s and a time even more distant than the 1920s. That's namely the era of the period around 1900 through 1903, a period before Harper's book takes place. I find it useful to place 1900 to 1903 beside the period 2020 through 2023, with the Milk Tea Alliance's exiles on my mind as well. I could have read a different paragraph that also has a bait and switch, making you think that it's about the present, but it's actually about the past. And here's the other paragraph that I could have read. In the 24-month period made up of years that ended with a 0 and with a 1, a man whose life had already gone through many stages, even though he was still a bit under 30, was working hard to carve out a new role for himself in exile. Just a few years earlier, he had been working through official channels within the political community in which he had grown up, but now he was cut off from that place because his effort to work within the political community had hit an impossible dead end. He was cut off from the place that he had worked within official channels, but he kept busy writing, traveling when he could, speaking to groups about his ideals and the problems in the place he had left behind, looking for allies, setting up new endeavors, often giving talks to other people who had left the place that he had come from. He was glad to have found a capital in which to be based, a city in which to be based in another part of the world in which he might be a foreigner, but where his linguistic skills were relevant, and where he found some locals sympathetic to his cause, and he had a good chance of meeting people involved in other struggles with whom he had things in common. Now, that paragraph that I just read, thinking of the earlier period, could be about Liang Qichao, who at 27 in 1900 had spent time speaking to diaspora groups in places like Hawaii and Australia, and then settled in Yokohama and had ties to Tokyo in 1901. And soon after arriving in Japan, he was establishing a periodical and forming an organization that increased his already notable stature in radical circles. He had worked within the system within the Qing in 1898, a reform struggle that seemed amazingly like it might be able to succeed, but then had been crushed. And had been crushed brutally, with some of the people involved in it executed, many others driven into exile. But the paragraph I read could equally well have been written with Nathan Law in mind. Nathan Law moved to London in 2020 at about the same age that Liang Qichao moved to Japan. And now, still close to 30, or about the same age that Liang was when he settled in Yokohama. Law has traveled to Washington and returned to London, his base while in exile, and he has been doing things such as launching a first book and setting up an organization called the Hong Kong Umbrella Community. So again, there are lots of contrasts that could be noted to go along with the parallels. But there are the parallels, including that Nathan Law, to remember, before he was in exile, he was elected to the LegCo in Hong Kong. And it seemed that against all odds, there might be a way that reform would come to a place in a way like that. And then that whole struggle was crushed. And there are parallels not only between Nathan Law's situation and Liang Qichao's, but a figure who's more famous and more associated with a successful struggle than Liang Qichao, namely Sun Yat-sen. When Sun Yat-sen was about the same age, a little bit older than these people, he moved around the world, and unlike Liang Qichao, who found usefulness in his linguistic skills in Chinese characters that he could write and communicate with people in Japan, Sun Yat-sen had English language skills like Nathan Law, and spent time in London, worried about being pursued, as Nathan Law worries about it, as exiles from Hong Kong worry about it. And in Sun Yat-sen's case, was actually kidnapped for a time in London. So there wasn't something like, I like to bring up Sun Yat-sen because that actually gets us to something with more kind of parallels to the Milk Tea Alliance thing. When Sun Yat-sen was in exile, one of the things that he did was connect up with activists. He was very interested in a movement in the region he had come from that had succeeded against seemingly impossible odds. He was very inspired at one point around 1900 by what had happened in the Philippines, when the Philippine independence movement had achieved a fair degree of success. He also connected with Japanese activists who were supportive of the struggle against the Qing and struggle against Western imperialism, leaving aside the fact that at later points Japan became an empire, or was already becoming an empire that some people in the region saw as just a new kind of dominator. It was something where there was a possibility for common cause. So it's not as though these will, I mean, when I bring up Nathan Law and I bring up Liang Qichao, particularly for people who are steeped in Chinese history, Liang Qichao, after he left China, he moved out of that same kind of political activism and was known mostly for this intellectual work and his publishing ventures, starting magazines, doing a role in bringing to Chinese intellectuals the ideas of the world and translating and bringing those together. And that's not what Nathan Law is doing as a figure. He's written a book, but he's not engaged in that kind of thing. But there is somebody moving outside of the realm of Hong Kong and China who is not in exile, but while still in Thailand is doing things that bring somewhat that side of Liang Qichao to mind. And the person I'm thinking of here, who I interviewed in July when I made my first trip to Thailand, or I didn't interview when I made my first trip to Thailand because he was on a Buddhist retreat at the time. But I interviewed his colleagues and I've communicated with and interviewed him long distance, is a young Thai named Netawit Chotafat Faisal. My Thai pronunciation, I have no idea if it's correct. I can fake the Chinese, but Thai is beyond me. But in Thai, the tendency is to refer to people by their first name, so I'll simply be calling him Netawit, the easier of his two names to pronounce for me. So he's a Thai student activist who's now in his late 20s or around 30, about the same age as Nathan, about the same age actually as Joshua Wong, who's a little bit younger than Nathan. He has been central to campus political organizations in Thailand, but he also founded a press, Samyan Press, that publishes translations, some of which he does himself or in tandem with colleagues. He has translations of books by and about an amazingly complex constellation of figures. Hannah Arendt, Václav Havel, Martin Luther King Jr., Joshua Wong, and Liu Xiaobo. Samyan Press has special meaning to me. It's the only press that has published a translation of Vigil, my own book. And there's a sense in which this is looking for bringing to a Thai audience of young people ideas from around the world that might give them some inspiration for a struggle against the authoritarianism they're facing. They've also brought out the translation of Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. And I thought about this when I was going through this list of translations and thinking about how this is somebody who's very different from a figure like Nathan Law, who may be reading some of those same figures. But I thought about the farewell lecture, the moving farewell lecture at CUHK that one of my discussants gave. And actually, when he talked through the final lecture and talked about the inspirations to his life, the reading list had a lot of parallels and overlaps to the book list of Samyan Press. So this, I think I'll move quickly toward the end of this by talking a little bit about the connections of things that have come out in the interviews I've been doing and raise a couple of things out of the very preliminary things that I've gotten, particularly I think because they're different, so they might be interesting with the Thai activists, both in exile or in some case in exile, in some case ones that I met with when I was in Thailand and others that I've been interviewing. And so I was very interested in Netawit from an early time, because I think if we want to think about a milk tea alliance not distant past, but the Milk Tea Alliance before the Milk Tea Alliance in the recent times. I think one early thing that happened that was important to that, and certainly important to my thinking about it, involves Netawit and Joshua Wong and their sense of having common goals and a sense of connection. Netawit is the Thai student who tried to bring Joshua Wong to Bangkok to lecture in 2016. And the Chinese authorities, we assume, put pressure on the Thai authorities to stop Joshua Wong from entering. And this is very much, by the way, like when imperial powers in different parts of Asia, or imperial powers and autocrats in different parts of Asia 100 years ago, would try to block people from moving from place to place through those kinds of alliances they had then. So Joshua Wong was blocked from coming in. And so he delivered a lecture by Skype, which at that point was a very unusual thing to do. Now we wouldn't think twice of it. But that was an interesting kind of way of the Milk Tea Alliance, even at that early moment. It wasn't being used as the term, but that connecting of struggles was something that was using the new technologies. The interesting thing as well, when I've thought about Netawit and Joshua, and one of the things I asked Netawit to confirm for me was if they saw them. He saw as a young person in Thailand, learning about what Joshua Wong was doing as a teenager initially in Hong Kong. He wanted to meet this person. He saw them as having similar kinds of goals of fighting back against autocracy, and thought they could learn from each other. And I asked if the fact that Joshua was devout Christian and he was a devout Buddhist had something to do with it. And he confirmed that there was that added, even though it was a different religion, there was a sense of a shared feeling of their activism being linked to their religious faith was something else they had in common, as well as being starting activism from a very young age, as well as finding inspiration from some similar things. It's also interesting, a tidbit about the bringing Joshua, when Netawit wanted to bring Joshua to Bangkok in 2016, at first being only focused on one nation or one country's history, I just thought, okay, there's autocracy being fought in these two places, so I can see why Joshua Wong had been involved in a successful effort to block patriotic education. Netawit was trying to struggle against counterpart kinds of things. But if I had really known Thai history, or if I'd paid more attention to Thai history, I would have noticed that there was something about bringing him in 2016. It was the 40th anniversary of the most important, in many ways, massacre of Thai student activists. And the occasion of bringing him to Thailand was on the 40th anniversary to be connected to that. And knowing about Hong Kong, we know how much anniversaries of an important massacre are part of what kept traditions of activism alive. So that was yet another connection, as well as the others. And when I was in Thailand in last summer, and I was talking to the students there about the Milk Tea Alliance, one of the things they talked about was to continue this sense of connectedness between Hong Kong and Thailand. The Hong Kongers in exile had sent them some gear that you could use when trying to deal with tear gas, because they were no longer on the streets dealing with tear gas, but Thai students were. And the Thai students wanted to think of a way to reciprocate, because part of this alliance is about reciprocating in ways by if you show solidarity for something that I show solidarity when you're doing, or if there's something I can't talk about in my country, in my part of the world, but you can talk about in your part of the world, you bring it up. So the Thai students, I thought, came up with a beautiful way to show reciprocity. They knew that in Hong Kong now you could not commemorate June 4th in public ways safely, but that was something that they could do. So they held a vigil with candles in the spirit of the Hong Kong one in a different place. And this is one of the ideas scholar James Buchanan has been working on. I'm not sure if he coined it or not, an idea of protest swapping, doing in another place what people can't do in the place that you're from. And I think that's an interesting thing. And it's not, again, completely without precedent. If you wanted to criticize one imperial power, you might publish things in a place controlled by another imperial power 100 years ago. So I'll end here by just saying some of my hypotheses that are starting to be changed, or in some cases changed and in some cases confirmed by the interviews I've been doing, where I've been trying to deal with this issue of what explains sticking with movements after they seem to have hit impossible obstacles, which I think is something that happened 100 years ago, 110 years ago, and is happening now. And I think there are several reasons that I thought of before I started this, and they've been a few have been added to them. One is that I think religious faith can be one of the things that keeps people going. And I know hearing speeches comments by Benny Tai since the end of 2019, there have been, he expresses a faith that Hong Kong's best days are ahead of it. And this is rooted, I think, in a kind of view of the world, the universe making sense in a certain way through religion. I think religion is something that promises a future, and or ideology, formal ideologies. In an earlier period, Marxism would often, or for some still, Marxism promises a direction of history as a formal ideology. Doing the interviews has confirmed that, but it's also added something else, that there are people who do not have religious faith or a formal ideology, but still have a belief that the universe, in Martin Luther King's turn, the arc of the universe bends toward justice. And there is an idea that no matter how dark things look, there will be, there's a logic to it moving forward. I have to say, personally, this fascinates me because I'm not a person of religious faith, and I'm also not a person of that particular kind of faith either, but I don't discount it as a motivation. Another motivation is that people know a bit about history and realize that there are historical examples of times when seemingly impossible struggles succeeded. And I think this is tremendously important, and it helps explain why certain writers or figures from history loom very large in the imagination of people who stick with these movements. Nelson Mandela would be one of the key examples. Václav Havel would be another. People who, if you looked at their career at a certain moment in time, you would say they have failed. Their movements have failed, and there is really no way to imagine they will succeed, and yet they did succeed. So I think that a knowledge of history, and I am a historian. I'm not a person of religious faith, but I am a historian. So I do think that one thing that history teaches us is that seemingly impossible things do happen. Amazingly surprising things happen. And by the way, this happened in the 1910s and 1910s and 20s. The Communist Party of China, at a certain point, seemed objectively to have absolutely, well, virtually no chance of succeeding, and yet it did succeed. So there's a knowledge of the world can shift and seemingly impossible things can happen. So that's, I think, another part of the story. A third part of the sort of way that people stick with impossible movements is simply that they feel, and this was something I didn't appreciate as much, they feel a sense of obligation toward people who have sacrificed for that movement before or are sacrificing it present. One reason exiles continue struggling is because they have friends who are in prison, and it would be just hard to live with themselves if they gave up on something that other people are sacrificing more for. And connected in a way to that is there's a sense, the way in which the movement has become a second family for people in a kind of kinship. This is something that the scholarship on Hong Kong has brought home very strongly with the language of 2019, with the idea of kind of siblinghood, of hands and feet, of connection, that to say, why are you sticking with a movement is like saying, why do you stay committed to your family? And then last, but not so different from all of these, is an idea that simply one's identity has become so connected with being part of the movement that that's simply who one is. And so most of these I had an inkling of before I started carrying out the interviews, but I think what's come home to me carrying them out is it's foolish to pretend that you can disentangle these, that actually with a lot of these examples, there's a blending of them. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in now. And another kind of blending is, the last thing I'll say is, I mentioned at the outset that I'm intrigued by this fact that even in a time of globalization, regional proximity still seems to matter. That people, the Milk Tea Alliance isn't people scattered across the world, or it is people now scattered across the world, but the countries or communities involved are near each other and are connected. And there's a loose connection with the shadow of China, but also I think there's a connection of being nearby. And some of that is that you're more likely to travel short distances. But even aside from that, I think there is something that in the imagining of geographies, there is a tendency sometimes to place places together. But again, I think it's important to make room in your mind for multiple things, because it's also possible for certain kinds of struggles to become almost kind of honorary members of your region. And I've seen this happening in the last year quite dramatically with Ukraine. There's a way in which it feels very natural for Milk Tea Alliance discussions to segue into discussions of solidarity with Ukraine, because in part there seems such a parallel between the threat being threatened by Moscow and being threatened by Beijing in one way or another, but also just because there were, even before this, in Hong Kong at least in 2019, there was a lot of inspiration taken from the Maidan protests. It's a seemingly impossible struggle that succeeded. A documentary about that was very influential. And so I'll just end by saying, when I was in Thailand having this moving discussion, I've a moving discussion about putting on a Tiananmen vigil on a Thai campus to show solidarity with Hong Kongers who were part of a kind of lost community and couldn't do that. The other thing that I was shown on the campus was a beautiful painting that the students were very proud of that was expressing solidarity to Ukraine. So I'll end there. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I think it's very insightful to bring out those historical analogies, and audience like me will really be genuinely surprised by the connection between Nathan Law and Liang Qizhao. I think that's a very interesting part. So we'll invite our discussion, and so Kim, you will go first.
All right. Thank you, Jeff, for your wonderful presentations. Jeff raised a lot of interesting observations in the talk about the effect of role models, about intellectual leadership, about protest swapping. I never heard about it. It's very interesting. A religious faith and the art of impossible, a lot of interesting observations. But I would like to focus on the part about parallels of different protests, because it gives rise to the possibility of forming an alliance across regions. You talk about parallels across time and space, but for the past decade, I believe that the common ground for this struggle to share the experience, because they are all under China's shadows. In many countries of this region, not only that they look up to China's market, some of them, some of the countries even have to rely on Chinese investment or even subsidies to build infrastructures and boost up their economy. So this gives an opportunity for the China model to spread in the region and then strengthen the authoritarian regime here. In the case of Hong Kong, we witnessed a sudden collapse of one of the most liberal society in the world, because of this, rise of China models. Yeah, but as a discussion, let me be more critical. And talking about this parallel and alliance, let me raise a couple of questions. First, I already wrote it down. Whether it is feasible to form a movement alliance across regions. Now, we know that there are peak organizations among CSO in the form of federations or alliance beyond national boundaries, such as those in the field of environment. As the problem they are facing are usually transnational in nature, right? But however, many democratic movements in the past decade are mobilized through social media. The form of leadership in this networked movement is usually very diffuse, if not completely leaderless. So no one in the movement dare to represent other participants. Even Joshua Wong couldn't say that I represent other people in the movement. So in this case, it usually makes the negotiation with the authority very difficult. So if there is no centralized leadership could be found within the movement, how could it move beyond the national boundaries to create any form of alliance with other movements? That is the question, first question. The second question is how useful to establish such an alliance. Now, in the case of Hong Kong, protesters are more conscious in establishing link with media, NGO, and politicians in US and European countries because they want these countries to impose censorship against China's. But forming alliance with protesters in the same region seem less important in terms of maneuvering global, political and economic leverage. As many governments in the region, as I mentioned, rely so much on China. So how useful to form an alliance among these, protesters? Well, having said that, I agree with Jeff that there's still very important meaning for this group of protesters in the region to share their experience. I would say the first, they are very important moral support when they could share their experience. Now, witnessing people in the same cohort fighting for democracy in neighborhood and country, it will strengthen young people, believe that they are standing on the right side of history. That is very important. When they watch the news, seeing other people using similar tactics, sacrificing their career or even their life, fighting for the same cause, they feel that, wow, we are on the right track. We're standing on the right side of the history, right? It may even create a kind of snowballing effect in the region. Well, second, I would say that it is very inspirational when you take reference of the tactics of the democratic movement in the neighboring countries. Now, say for example, the success of sunflower movement in Taiwan stimulated the young protesters in Hong Kong to speed up the Occupy movement that resulted in umbrella movement. I know it very clearly because after these young people went to Taiwan to observe the sunflower movement, when they came back to Hong Kong, they became so impatient for leaders like me that you have to, delay and delay in order to wait for the opportunity to negotiate with the authority. They believe that you should occupy first before any, negotiations should take place. So it is the effect of sunflower movement. But after the umbrella movement, I went to Japan and talked to some young protesters there in Tokyo. They told me that they were very much affected by the peaceful tactics of the umbrella movement. And then they start a new kind of, protest in Japan, the anti-nuke movement, the anti-militarism movement in Japan. Because in 1960, because the Japanese student movement was so radical, violent, that it scared away a lot of public support. So after the movement died down for so many years, they observed what happened in Hong Kong, and then they learned from it, particularly the idea of joyful resistance. So they start this new round of movement, and they earned a lot of public sympathy from the public. So we see how this, snowballing effect happened in the region. And I myself even suspect that the series of Korean movie about the democratic struggle in 1980s also affect how Hong Kong people understand the meaning of violence protests. Because if you look at this, you watch this kind of movie, there are lots of impressive films about how Korean students using the Molotov cocktail, confronting the police in front of Yonsei University. And I believe that it may make many Hong Kong people become more sympathetic to those more confrontational tactics adopted in the 2019 anti-extradition movement. So I believe that even though a formal alliance might not be feasible or useful under this situation, but I believe that it still provides lots of moral support, inspiration for people, particularly protesters, to interact with each other in the region. It's more or less like milk tea. It will be very refreshing when we feel very exhausted during the democratic struggle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. So Dave, your turn.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. I have many nostalgic, fond memories of us talking about these things when driving to conferences over the years. So I have kind of two sets of comments. The first is I very much appreciate that you're trying to tackle what's a really important question when it comes to the Milk Tea Alliance, which is what's happening with it now? Because I think anyone who's been following the Milk Tea Alliance will naturally ask, we don't really follow it on Twitter anymore. Mm-hmm. And so, there's kind of this, your talk made me think that there's very much two eras of the Milk Tea Alliance. There's when it was a thing on Twitter and post-Twitter Milk Tea Alliance. And I think you're asking an important question of, Twitter, not even getting into Elon Musk and Twitter and how it's changed, but just the very fact that the Milk Tea Alliance is no longer on Twitter, the fact that there's still people clinging to these alliances is a very interesting question and something that needs to kind of be addressed. But that being said, I do think there needs to be a bit more reconciling with what exactly the Milk Tea Alliance was when it was on Twitter. I'm, of course, thinking of the research paper that Austin Wong and Adrian Ralfleisch did for the Wilson Center, where they scraped every single tweet about the Milk Tea Alliance, and they analyzed every single time that the Milk Tea Alliance was trending and in which country and what kind of precedented each kind of wave of the Milk Tea Alliance. And the reason I bring this up is because, their findings is that there was the Milk Tea Alliance, but there were really kind of two Milk Tea Alliances. There was the pro-democracy Milk Tea Alliance, and there was the anti-CCP Milk Tea Alliance. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's a lot of interactions between the two, but these aren't inherently the same thing. Especially when, when the Milk Tea Alliance hashtag was mobilized for Southeast Asia, it had nothing to do with China. China was very rarely mentioned. And it's quite the opposite when it comes to Hong Kong and when Milk Tea Alliance was mobilized there. And these aren't necessarily contradictory. It's more that, when we think about Milk Tea Alliance, I think it's really important to kind of take into account this variation in kind of what exactly it was. And because sometimes there were contradictions. I think, there's the critiques of the Milk Tea Alliance are, for example, far-right folks in India evoking Milk Tea Alliance who are, inherently not particularly pro-democratic, but very anti-China with kind of their sentiment. So when you think about, what happened to the Milk Tea Alliance, where does it go from here? I'm really curious to know, what can the data we have about what the Milk Tea Alliance was when it was an online phenomenon, what can that really tell us about kind of the post-Milk Tea Alliance world that kind of now exists? But turning to kind of this kind of post-Milk Tea Alliance era that is kind of the main subject of your research. The idea of, under what conditions do we really see these protests these movements lasting, and why do people cling to these movements? I instantly think of kind of this big body in the social movement world of movement outcomes. And how, political sociologists approach the question of movement outcomes, not necessarily in these binary success failure, but instead thinking about just all the different kinds of, path dependencies that changed as a result of these movements. And someone like Edwin Amenta at our very own UC Irvine has written extensively on this, and would actually be a really interesting person to talk to, I think. But some of the other connections that I would be curious to think about when we think of these kind of solidarities that still exist. So first of all, I was hoping that the Wild Lily and Tiananmen connection would make it in. As of course, I'm thinking of Teresa Wright's book. And I really think there's something still to be said if you look at a historical context of Wild Lily. There's really not so much in English language discourse, at the very least, that really ties the solidarity between Wild Lily protesters and Tiananmen protesters outside of Teresa's book. And I really think there's probably something more to be said. But what's interesting to me is when we think about today's context and this idea of protest swapping and the existence of this kind of pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian nature of the Milk Tea Alliance, about what does that actually look like in Taiwan's context today? Because the idea of Taiwanese solidarity with other protest movements is something I think a lot about. And every time I go to, a solidarity action in Taiwan, I'm always looking to see, who's going, how many people are going, what's civil society's response. And of course, we just had the white paper, the A4 Revolution solidarity actions in Taiwan, and they were very poorly attended. Not a lot of people went. Now, of course, there's a lot of kind of online commentary from politicians and past sunflower activists all made statements online. But there's often a very big misconception that there would be a lot of kind of this protest swapping action happening in Taiwan, where people in Taiwan would see that you can't do that in Hong Kong anymore. Therefore, we would embody this kind of pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian sentiment here. But something like the Tiananmen vigils that pre-2019 in Hong Kong were a fundamental part of Hong Kong's lifeblood. In Taiwan, as time has gone on, the Tiananmen protests are decreasingly attended. It's more and more. It's a smaller and smaller moment, and that's actually something that Ming Shou's written about that he could probably comment on. But the idea that Taiwan would have this kind of natural solidarity with these different kind of protest movements isn't as apparent as I think you would anticipate, because Taiwan is often considered to be a part of the Milk Tea Alliance, but from my own observation, Taiwan seems to be one of the smallest players in the Milk Tea Alliance, especially when compared to places like Hong Kong or Thailand, which are, to me, Hong Kong and Thailand really do stick out as the biggest advocates or the most common groups to kind of use the Milk Tea Alliance. I'd be interested to know if going forward, the idea of being able to look more at what makes some of these places different from each other. So you talk about a lot about why is regional solidarity a thing, and I based off of not just sort of how the Milk Tea Alliance varied in its politics when it was a hashtag on Twitter, but how it's continuing to vary kind of in its afterlife. I think the idea of what regional solidarity really looks like isn't even, it almost isn't so apparent to me, because I see solidarities between activists, absolutely. But the idea that there really is kind of a shared regional Milk Tea Alliance set of politics, and that all of these different Milk Tea Alliance countries are really kind of adhering to these politics, I think the story is actually more complicated, and I think that's interesting. I think that's good that it's actually more complicated for those reasons. The last other thing I wanted to add was there is I have to say something about political parties. Movements that become parties in the United States. There's a great book by Mildred Schwartz, who's a sociologist, and her book is called "Movement Parties in Abeyance." You know as well as I do as an American that small parties in the United States don't go anywhere, and yet they still exist. And why is that? Because why create these big political organizations that will never actually go anywhere? And it's this big discussion about the value of abeyance and the value of existence for its own sake. And I think there's probably something in the organization's literature that still might be something that still might have value for that, it's based in an American context, but might actually have something to say for this part of the world as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think, Jeff, you already got a handful. So you want to go first by responding to these comments?
Sure. They were wonderful comments and gave me so much to think about. And I had actually been thinking about the Korean inspiration. The Korean side, I think, is I didn't mention Korea. I meant to. Thinking in part of the candlelight movement as an example of a success against great odds. But I think, and I actually was thinking about the influence of the democracy movements in Korea in the 80s as an influence. It's often not mentioned enough on Tiananmen protesters, an awareness of what was happening in a very different system. But I hadn't thought about that idea of the representations of violence in the films, not just inspiring students perhaps to engage in that violence, but developing a tolerance in a broader community because of thinking of it as succeeding. And at the same time, I think, Kinman, your comment about Japan was very interesting, that there can be a way in which a movement, the tactics and inspiration can be drawn even when it's a radically different kind of setting, but there's a fascination with an element of the movement that's seized on, whether it's the peacefulness, joyful resistance, which is a great term, but also increasingly the sort of be water idea from 2019 was something that was picked up in ways of dealing with tear gas in places far from the region. There were some references to a kind of Hong Kong strategies in Belarus and in the United States in places. So that I think is important to think about. And also this idea, I love the idea of milk tea as refreshment. This a way of keeping your spirits up. That is part of it. And that's segueing to Lev's idea of these two things that the Milk Tea Alliance could mean. A sort of shared aspiration for democracy and specifically anti-CCP thing. I think we've seen, that helps me put into perspective some of the things that I've been hearing and coming across when I focus on the Hong Kong side. Which is one thing that was just really fascinating that only links up to the democracy definition of Milk Tea Alliance. In Japan, recently, there was an event put on to talk about Milk Tea Alliance, and they had Nathan Law, and they paired him with an Okinawan activist, which was a very interesting way of saying, like, if we're talking, which was purely thinking about shared authoritarian, opposition to authoritarianism positions. That has nothing to do with China. In fact, quite the opposite. And the Hong Kong exiles that told me about that and found it quite exciting that was happening. We're also talking about how their growing interest in Tibetan activism as something that has endured, and the connecting of interests among Tibetan. There are more events now. They started to happen in Hong Kong in 2019, but there are more of them now that place the Xinjiang, the Uyghur, Tibetan, and Hong Kongers into a kind of category together. The two things that I feel that I meant to talk about that I didn't talk about. One was I didn't bring up explicitly that some of the people who have been most inspirational that I've been interviewing have been female activists. And there is actually, that's a whole nother side of this that there is in the Milk Tea Alliance. And I think we saw this even more to some extent in the white paper protests that was going on. The white paper protests not involving protest swapping, or there not being the Taiwan side. I actually think of the white paper protests, there was a kind of protest swapping that was crucial, namely the keeping alive the slogans from the Beijing banner was done by students on American campuses. And that was a kind of role of exile or of action in different places that actually has parallels going back 100 years when the first May 4th protests, the first protests in what later became the May 4th movement took place among Chinese students in Tokyo in 1918, who then had a short-lived movement against some of the same things and then went to the mainland. But another way in which I think there's one final aspect that maybe isn't articulated as specifically the Milk Tea Alliance, but is part of this story somehow of young activists in Burma, which I haven't talked about enough, but Thailand and Hong Kong. There's a shared sense among some of them that of an older generation having failed them and time running out. And that has led to a connection that has nothing to do with region, which is a connection to the climate extinction, the climate strike protests. And there was, in that same kind of sharing online at the same time that Netawit and Joshua Wong were expressing a sense of shared struggle, Joshua Wong and Greta Thunberg were engaging in a kind of mutual support set of activities in which there was this kind of notion of a generation that was going to have to live with the consequences of what an older generation had done, and feeling a kind of need to ratchet things up and to try new things and to express connections. So that's a kind of totally sort of somewhat parallel to some of the Milk Tea Alliance things, but not having to do with region at all and not having to do with milk tea. But no, these are extraordinary. It's been a wonderful experience to get these comments, in part by, with Kinman being able to say, as a pragmatic example of the inspiration from Taiwan and the connection there, to have lived through it. And it's very good to be reminded of the 1989 and early 1990s connection as another one of these. If I'm going to talk about milk tea-like percolation across borders, to mix my hot drink metaphors, definitely that moment is one important too. And you actually could have a mid 1980s to early 1990s burst of activity to go with the others, in which and there was one protest in 1986, the lead up to Tiananmen. While the protests in China at that point were very much about internal things, there was a banner that said, "The Philippines have showed us the way," an awareness of people power. So there are ways in which the regional things matter, but still need to dig into it more. Thank you so much, both of you, for those very stimulating comments.
Thank you, Jeff. We will still inviting audience to post their questions. 也可以写中文哈，如果说大家有问题的话，不要客气。In the meantime, I do have some response to Jeff's comments. I think there are a lot of interesting way to further elaborate your insight presented in your lecture. I think the number one issue is that I think you were right that in this highly globalized and mobilized era, I think we still have physical proximities, geographical closeness still important. That explains the very beginning of Milk Tea Alliance. But I'm more intriguing about that is uneven distributions. The way that a certain people in a region find resonance with another distant project is very difficult to explain that. Sometimes it connects. I'm thinking about Taiwan's example, like in the 80s, when we were having a pro-democracy struggles. All the comparison is always on South Korea, even though they are linguistic divide. It's easy to understand why, because we and South Korea are so similar. That for all the post-war trajectory, that we are fighting against the anti-communist dictatorship and so on. Whereas we didn't really have serious discussion about Philippines people's power. Even in terms of physical distance, it might be probably closer. So the way that people how make the connection, I think is really funny. And also inspired by Kim Man's comments. I think that sometimes people draw the wrong analogies, and sometimes people do that on purpose. Like I was thinking about the case in 2019 extradition protest in Hong Kong. People were screaming the documentary film Winter on Fire, which is about Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, which, according to a number of specialists, is actually a propaganda. It's a totally erroneous representation of what happened in Ukraine. But nevertheless, Hong Kong people drew strength and inspiration out of that. So I was wondering that in this cross-fertilization among the multi-alliances, members are how much confusion and misinterpretation will layer, and they will layer probably just for strategic purpose. And people were really not interested in the detail, or people are not really interested in what happened in the distance, and people are just interested in a lesson for themselves. That's my question for you. Maybe you can wait for a minute because we have questions coming up in the Slido. I wonder, Jeff, can you read a question on your end? Maybe you have to turn on your Slido.
No, maybe if you could read, if you could.
A question for you. The first question is typed in Chinese. Do you think that Myanmar has another chance for a new revolution, especially under the strict control of the military junta? That's the number one question. The number two question is typed in English. Let me read it for you. Social media as the primary means of communication may be subject to control by private companies. Are there any method to avoid this? I think this is Elon Musk and Twitter's questions. And the number three question is about Thai student movement. Is the movement going to have any influence or impact in the upcoming legislative election? So that's the number three question. Maybe you can respond it now.
Great. I would start actually by with what you said, Ming Shou, about the wrong analogies or analogies based on fiction. Actually, I think people often, I can't believe I went through this whole talk without talking about a key thing of the Milk Tea Alliance that binds it together is a fictional representation of an upheaval that never took place, the Hunger Games story. And the three-finger salute is a key binding thing that connects Hong Kong, Thailand, and Myanmar, and also other things. V for Vendetta, for some, it's a new version of actually thinking of people who drew inspiration from David and Goliath as a biblical story. There doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be accurate to be inspirational. And often people can draw a lesson that they find valuable from one aspect of a movement that may seem a kind of eccentric reading of it. I remember being told by some Eastern European dissidents or former participants in protests how inspiring they found Tiananmen. And at first, I couldn't figure, I was telling them, but actually Tiananmen wasn't about doing away with Communist Party rule, whereas yours were, it was a very different movement. It was a confusion, but that wasn't what they meant. What they meant sometimes, they said the tank man was so inspiring. And it was purely that even if it was a totally different kind of movement, the personal bravery against impossible odds was something that can be inspirational, even if nothing else about it kind of matches up. Okay, about Burma, whether the Burmese movement is really extraordinary. And in a way, that's one other reason that the Milk Tea Alliance idea both continues, but also seems to lose specificity is what's going on in Burma is so dramatically different. It's so much of an ongoing pitched armed struggle against incredible oppression. It's very different. I have no idea what will happen next. I think history just typically tells us that there are surprises. I mean, I do know that many people were very surprised that there was any loosening to begin with in Burma the first time around, and then were surprised again at how complicit Aung San Suu Kyi became with things that were happening. So I would leave it to one of the people that I interviewed, who was the 1988 activist, who went through a period of wondering if he would ever be able to reconnect with his family or go back to Burma. And then amazingly, he was able to for a time. And now he's once again living basically again as an exile. And he said something to me, though, in one of my communications. He wrote, when I asked him how he was doing, he said, "Sometimes I feel helpless, but I don't feel hopeless." So if somebody who's lived through all of this can still hold out the possibility or the hope, I'm not going to say it's impossible. I don't see a scenario where there's a positive ending in Burma, but often there have been cases again where, a part of me thought there would always be apartheid in South Africa when I was growing up, and there isn't. A part of me thought there would always be intractable problems in Israel and Palestine, and there are. So that teaches us not to predict in that way. Social media is subject to control by private companies. It's also subject to control and interference by governments. So it's an impossibly problematic tool, and yet periodically it proves incredibly important despite all that. The white paper protests really couldn't have spread the way they did if there hadn't been a kind of inventive use of social media. So I'm skeptical about it, and I certainly don't. I think it's been thoroughly discredited, the idea that people believed, as Liu Xiaobo did for a time, and many other people, everyone from Bill Clinton to Thomas Friedman, were George Will, who were saying that once the internet was there, the Chinese Communist Party would not be able to control communication, and then of course there was a way to control the internet. So I think the way to think of social media in authoritarian settings. It's an ongoing effort by both companies and governments to control, and for others to try to find ways around that control. And this seems to be one of the moments where the negative aspects of social media are significantly outweighing the positive ones, but then you have something like the white paper protests that cause you to question again how that goes. And what was the third question? Sorry.
How Thai students movement are going, whether it's going to have any influence in the upcoming legislative election?
So that I really, again, this is a predictive one, which I really don't know. But I think that there is certainly a chance for a reinvigoration or renewed activity once the focus is less on the election. This Thailand is a place that Lev really should study next, because we have a great number of examples of movements that lead to creation of parties, that lead to the end of parties. It's exactly the kind of thing you've been studying. But I still feel I'm trying to get up to speed on the complexities of the Thai situation, so I wouldn't try to predict that.
3 new questions. Maybe I'll invite Kim-Man and Lev to answer this question as well, and then joined by Lev, and you can conclude, wrap up by everything. Let me read the first question, which is typed in Chinese, because I don't want to simplify it. So let me read in Mandarin. 从雨伞革命到白纸革命，无论香港或中国年轻人世代似乎开始从抗争转出逃，是否代表年轻世代已经放弃了各固化的权力结构做出抵抗，只能选择放弃，并且尽一切努力方法去逃避？ 那么无论未来是否奶茶联盟或甚至中国的零星革命是否零星对抗争是否都会逐渐衰微。I think this might be a question that interests Kingman very much. And the second question is, do the authoritarian regime also have their transnational alliance? If yes, is it a phenomenon in the 21st century, or does it happen in Liang Qitao times? These kind of unholy alliances. And the last question is for transnational movements in Asia. Do you think what could be collectivity or shared identity in order to do campaign in the future? I think this is a rather open question. So maybe I have two discussions coming first, and then Jeff, you can do a final wrap up.
Great.
Answer in Chinese or English for the first questions? English.
Maybe I don't know. Maybe.
对你随便，对你随便。
一起用中文会比较好吧？我想。
OK， 好，没问题。I'm sorry, Jeff, I have to answer in English, Chinese
没问题。
这个问题是没法现在马上有答案的，因为举个例子，以香港来讲，通过国安法以后，就很多的公开的抗议的活动都没法做了，然后也开始有不少人要离开香港，现在到目前为止大概有40万人。那这样整个运动就已经死掉了，还是说他还在等待另外一个机会再出来？我觉得暂时是没法马上就有一个很清楚的答案。我只想做一个比较，就是说我们看一看在1968年在捷克发生什么事情。那个时候就是这个布拉格之春，就给那个苏联用军队镇压了。镇压以后有9年时间是保持非常安静的，看起来好像整个反抗的运动在捷克已经是死掉了。可是到了1977年，我们看到那个七七宪章就走出来。那个时候你看到在之前其实有很多的地下的一些沙龙出版的东西已经存在了，其实它没有表面的非常公开的对抗的活动。那所以有时候在这个政治环境太坏的情况下面，有很多的参与者会把这个 keep their head low， 就是把暂时低调一点，不代表这个运动就死掉了。我暂时看到就是说，离开了香港的有很多的香港人还在工作当中。那比较当年1989年离开中国的一些民运分子，不同的地方是，现在在香港人当中、海外香港人当中，实际上非常多的媒体是海外的香港媒体。那些人呢，都是在香港从事专业的媒体工作的。那现在大概有相当多的媒体已经出来了，然后呢，有很多的 KOL， 就是那些网红，他们大部分留在台湾，也每天在做很多节目有关香港的状态。所以我觉得还是有一个群体在形成当中，还是保持对香港的政治问题的关注的。所以我觉得这个 The organization is dead, but the movement is still alive。我只会这样讲了。这句话是在波兰那个团结工会当年给取缔以后，那这个法国的社会学家进去研究以后，发现对了，这个组织好像已经死掉了，可是这个运动还在活的，因为每个人还保持一种信念，所以我觉得不能太快做下一个定论。
对，那这个也跟刚才Professor Watson 这种讲的很有关，就是你很多时候会被后来发展我未预期的发展都很多都未来是很难说的了我想是这样。And Dev, you want to come in for the question?
Sure. So, yeah, the question of pro-authoritarian movements around the world, colloquially, you might hear them referred to online as tankies, or these kind of sort of unironically supportive of the Chinese Communist Party, or unironically supportive of authoritarian regimes. There's actually more and more people paying attention to these. There's actually, I know there's one master's student here in Taiwan at Tsinghua who is doing his master's thesis on this question, and there most certainly is these groups that exist, but the question of how relevant they are, how influential they are in democracies, I think is an important, but a kind of an unknown research question that I think a lot of people are trying to have a better understanding of. But the idea of having kind of these unironically pro-authoritarian groups is not new. Every decade, you can find examples of sort of people who are overly sympathetic with brutal authoritarian regimes, whether it was Cold War or even thinking back to say like French Maoists who were very sympathetic to Mao and his cause. You find these examples throughout time and history that it's not a new phenomenon, but it most certainly is a phenomenon in today's world.
Okay, Jeff, you will have a final wrap up.
So, no, I wish I would know for the third question, the possibility of transnational social movements be a collectivity, a shared identity to do political campaigns. It's still that's still an open question, and I think it's interesting that. But one thing that happens is that people who work together for one cause can sometimes end up working together for another. But I actually had a different reading of the second question than Lev, which I think that was fascinating, and I thought about it. But I was actually thinking of the alliance of power holders as opposed to supporters of authoritarians. And I was thinking about there are configurations now of the kind of whatever the Shanghai organization is, that you have a kind of league that has Putin and Xi Jinping and others together. And that, I think, there clearly are parallels back to Liang Qichao's time of the people who were opposing these activists having a kind of alliance. If we think not so much of China, but of different imperial powers that had a shared interest in maintaining colonies, that you certainly had groupings of an international order that were allied there. In the case of China, soon after Liang Qichao's movement was crushed, there was the Boxer Uprising, and then there was the Bagua Lianjun. There was an alliance of foreign powers that worked together to come into China. But more generally than that, I think if we think of the part of the Milk Tea Alliance is about learning strategies, borrowing ideas from one another, that we actually see a lot of examples of authoritarian regimes looking to one another for models. There's a wonderful book that came out about 10 years ago that I think is woefully underappreciated, William Dobson's The Dictator's Learning Curve, which was in part about how ideologically very different authoritarian strongmen or strongman-like regimes were modeling themselves on one another. And there you have that going back 100 years or more, strategies of crowd control, strategies of censorship, all of these kinds of mechanisms. You have an ongoing thing where protesters in different places are periodically looking at what other protesters are doing and saying, are there things that they're doing in this other place that we might find useful? But at the same time, you find that with authoritarian regimes or different kinds of power holders are doing that. And I think that's a wonderful, I think that is a wonderful place to end, because I think it's, I think it's always important to combine bottom-up analysis with thinking about what's going on at the top. And this can be shared technologies of control of, they're very uncomfortable, but in an appropriate way, work being done on the complicity of some American companies with making surveillance technologies that are then used in places like Xinjiang. So I think it's important to think about how people are connecting to oppose forms of oppression, but also how those complicit in one way or another for forms of oppression are engaged in these varied kinds of alliances or borrowing or shared techniques with each other as well.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Also, maybe in a way of a conclusion, I think what we learned from Jeff today is that what happening right now do have a historical precedence. And the anti-imperialist struggle 100 years ago actually show a lot of analogies and inspiring lessons for us, because a lot of questions was actually about the future of the protest, whether it's about Thailand, in Thailand or Myanmar or in China and Hong Kong. I think people are legitimately concerned about the future of this pro-democracy struggle. But I think one takeaway we got from Jeff's presentation is that if these struggles that was so objectively pessimistic and hopeless at that time can succeed, in the year to come, maybe we do have maybe we should have another look at these contemporary struggles happening in different parts of the world. So maybe that's a positive takeaway for today's lecture. So again, thank you very much for Jeff's wonderful presentation, and also appreciate Kim Mans and their participation and all the audience that are online. So hopefully we can come back to this topic again, and also we were looking forward Jeff's visit to Taiwan. Maybe we can have an online one. So thank you very much. So we'll conclude here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all of you did. Thank you.